Cool. I'm going to get us started. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. Thank you, Mita, for the reminder. So today, the structure of things is going to be a bit different in the sense that normally we've had a guest who's kind of come in and then I've done the presentation, we've been speaking, but today actually I wanted to have that conversation with you all throughout, especially as this is the last session and we're talking about self-determination and self-actualization. We'll kind of talk about the definition of those as we get further in today. But I really wanted to start thinking about how we visualize this idea of your reimagined classroom and recap on some of the things that we've been speaking about over the last 3 weeks, and just kind of pull out some of the key themes, keywords, some of the key sort of theories, principles that we can start to use when we're thinking about the classroom setting. And hopefully this will help when you go to put together this proposal for your tutors. So I'm going to share my screen with you so you can see the presentation. Cool. If you can see the screen, please just give me a heads up in the chat. I just want to make sure everyone's cool.
Yeah, we can see it.
And present. Cool, cool, cool. Great. All right, cool. So every week, always set the intentions. It's a peer-to-peer learning space. All your contributions are valuable, and I'm not here to be an authoritative voice, but rather just to spark and facilitate conversation, which, as I said before, we're going to be doing a lot more today because the session is more so about you, as opposed to listening to myself and someone else speak and then having the discussion at the end. I'd like to encourage that we kind of chat throughout. So literally, if at any point there's something, I've kind of put notice throughout the presentation, but if there's any point something comes up and you have a question about it, you want to talk about it, please just do whether drop in the chat or just pop up your camera. I'm happy for that to happen. And I'll also take notes so that I can send those around at the end if there's any key things that you kind of want to take away. And again, we're live streaming on YouTube, and please mute your mic if you're not speaking. So as I said, today's the last session. We're talking about self-determination and self-actualization. So I pulled up this definition of what self-determination means, and we're going to watch a video after this by the professor that kind of co-founded, co-coined this term. So self-determination has been used a lot in terms of politics, in the context of politics, to describe the process a country undergoes to assert its independence. But in terms of more a personal and in terms of psychology as well, self-determination is the ability or process of making one's own choices and controlling one's own life. It's a vital piece of psychological well-being. As you may expect, people like to feel in control of their lives. In addition to this idea of controlling one's own destiny, the theory of self-determination is relevant to anyone hoping to guide their life more. So skip ahead just before we start this video. It's on autoplay. So this was co-founded by Ed, I think it's Deci, and he's a professor of psychology at the University of Rochester, and specifically kind of created this theory called the self-determination theory, or SDT. And this is very much about human motivation. So what motivates us as human beings? What are the sort of components that we need to feel like we're functioning optimally or at our best, that we feel fulfilled? And I think all of these things are very important when we're talking about the learning space, which obviously is supposed to prepare us to go out into the world or how to enrich our practice. And when we're thinking about who we want to be in the world, I think it's useful to then think about the steps that it takes to get us there. And for many of us, education is one of those steps. So I think this is really interesting to be talking about right now. And the idea is that there are two main types of motivation. So intrinsic and extrinsic. So intrinsic is like your personal motivation, what moves you, what do you love, what are you naturally called to? And then extrinsic motivation being the kind of things that you do essentially because those motivations are decided and controlled for you. And so how does that differ in terms of the amount, how motivated you are to do certain things, how much effort, energy you're willing to put into certain things, and how fulfilled you feel after or during them. So both are powerful forces in shaping who we are and how we behave. And the idea of self-determination theory has three core elements, which are autonomy, relatedness, and competence. So in the video, I'm going to go back to, this is Ed Deci himself, the professor, speaking about just, what this theory means, how they came up with it. So it's about 8 minutes long. I'm going to play that, and then we can discuss that after the video, if you would like. I think it'd be a good point to pause there.
My name is Edward Deci. I'm a motivational psychologist, and for the last 40 years or so, Richard Ryan and I have worked together to develop, test, refine, elaborate a theory of motivation, development, and wellness that we call self-determination theory. It is not only the two of us who've been working on it, of course. There are literally hundreds of psychologists from around the world who've participated in the process. Self-determination theory begins by making an important distinction. Most people who think about psychology think about it as a unitary concept. Namely, it's something that differs just in amount. How can I get someone more motivated to do something? How can I get that person less motivated to do something? Really, the focus is always on amount. But from the beginning, Ryan and I have believed that it was important to think about types of motivation rather than the amount of motivation. Our primary distinction is between what we call autonomous motivation and controlled motivation. Autonomous motivation describes or names what you're doing when you're feeling a full sense of willingness, volition, and choice. Whatever the activity is, if you're doing it with a real sense of interest, enjoyment, and value, then it's likely that you're autonomously motivated. In contrast is controlled motivation. Controlled motivation refers to doing something in order to get some reward or to avoid some punishment. It means doing something because you're feeling pressured, demanded, obliged to be doing it. I think when most people think about motivation, they're more often thinking about controlled motivation than autonomous motivation. But we have found that when people are more autonomously motivated, the performance, their wellness, their engagement, all of those things are greater when you're autonomously motivated than when you're controlled in your motivation. So that's the first important distinction that we make in self-determination theory. The second important point is we believe that all human beings have a set of basic psychological needs. The needs that we believe are important are the need for competence, that is to say, to feel confident and effective in relation to whatever it is you're doing. Second, to feel relatedness, that is to say, to feel cared for by others, to care for others, to feel like you belong in various groups that are important to you. And the third need is autonomy. I've already said a bit about autonomy, but now I'm making the point that autonomy is actually a human need. And a human need is something that people must get satisfied for optimal wellness and optimal performance. If they don't get the needs satisfied, then there will be negative psychological consequences that follow. The concept of psychological needs being universal is an important one because it's what lets us know and understand what it is that will promote autonomous motivation. When people feel competent, when they feel related to others, and when they're feeling a sense of volition, they will be autonomously motivated, and the positive consequences will follow from that. So the importance of this is that when you ask questions like, how do you promote effective motivation in the workplace or in schools or in healthcare clinics, wherever it is, whatever domain of life you're talking about, if you're interested in producing optimal outcomes, the way in which you can do that as a parent or a teacher or an employer, the way that you can do that is create the circumstances so that people who are learning or playing or performing for you, so that they will be optimal in their outcomes. What you need to be doing is supporting their basic psychological needs. Now, when it comes to autonomous motivation, there are actually two types of autonomous motivation. When I first started doing this work, I was very interested in the concept of intrinsic motivation. To do something because you're intrinsically motivated means you do it because you find it interesting and enjoyable. That contrasts with extrinsic motivation, which means you do it because it leads to some separable consequence. Okay, so intrinsic motivation is one type of autonomous motivation. The other type of autonomous motivation was really developed by Richard Ryan. It was he who got interested in the idea of extrinsic motivation and whether extrinsic motivation could be autonomous or not. And what he found in research and in other research that we did together is that people can actually internalize extrinsic motivation in such a way as they own it as their own. And when they do that, when they understand the value of the activity that may be rewarded or requested of them, when they do that and identify with the value of it and integrate it so that it's a part of themselves, they will be autonomously motivated, and the outcomes that you observe in such situations will be very positive.
Cool. Okay, so I'm gonna pause that there and open it up to just say if anybody has any thoughts on that. Yeah, I'll start there. So by thoughts, so what I'm interested in discussing is, for example, he speaks about the two different forms of motivation. So there's the autonomous motivation, and then there's the controlled motivation. And maybe what might be interesting is to, within your learning spaces, name some of those different forms of motivations that you have, whether it's when you're producing a piece of work, when you're working on an assessment, when you're out doing research, whether that's like in-field primary research or secondary research reading. I'd love for you to name some of these different forms of motivation that you experience, and whether you've also had that experience of an extrinsic motivation becoming an intrinsic motivation because you believe and understand the value in what it is that you're doing. So I think this is really interesting to talk about when we're thinking about the structure of the classroom. If we can name what motivates us, then we can also start to think about the things that perhaps we feel demotivated by, and start to think about solutions in terms of how to address some of those things. So please do share, even if it's challenging, this idea, because none of these theories are absolutes. I think for me anyway, I see them as sort of guidance in terms of how we think about things, but it doesn't mean that it's entirely true or fact, and it might not entirely resonate. So that's also welcome.
Hello.
Hi. I can't see your name on the screen. Please say what your name is.
Oh, hi, it's Kerry.
Hi, Carrie.
Is the volume all right?
It's a bit low. If you can turn it up, that would be great.
Yeah, sorry, my headphones seem to just not be very good.
No worries. I can hear you. Hopefully everyone else can too.
I can speak a bit more loudly. Is that better?
Yeah, that's okay.
So yeah, I don't know if I have any like specific examples, but I experience like the controlled motivation of grading definitely like affects my is it intrinsic motivation or like autonomous motivation? Like actually, I guess maybe a good example is when I was growing up, like learning an instrument, I really specifically chose not to do grades because it just completely wiped out all enjoyment of the instrument.
Right.
And like took away that autonomous motivation. And I think I've experienced that as well in other learning spaces. And I guess it's kind of a hard thing to navigate because, you know, the university has to have some, or like maybe they don't have to, but it seemed like they have to have some sort of measurement of how well people are doing. But yeah, that often takes away from like the motivation of something you find really interesting. I don't know if anyone else finds that, but.
Yeah, before I respond, I think that's a good question to ask if anyone else finds or experiences that as well.
I think that's a really, really powerful metaphor, actually, Kerry, because I did piano as well, and to go through grades, you have to do all the scales and arpeggios, which are dull, and arguably it makes you no better a piano player to study with or without grades. So it's a really interesting idea to compare to a classroom structure in the sense that just because the structured way of learning has proven results doesn't mean it's the most effective way or most necessary way of learning. Yeah, it's a really, really interesting idea, that.
I agree. I like that you brought in the context of music. Anyone else want to add? I think the question that I would then ask is, what is it specifically about the grading structure or the metrics that are used to measure what is success or what's doing well that feel constrictive? Is there a way that perhaps, because as you're saying, it's like maybe, you know, the university does need to have a way of telling how well people are doing, whether the learning is effective, but maybe the metrics that are used are what is restrictive. And I'd love to kind of start to unpack what is it about them that's restrictive, and how could they be a bit less rigid, perhaps, if they are rigid?
Yeah, I think just personally for me, it's Kerry again. I think it's probably like the fear of failure. It's not necessarily being told like, oh, you're good at doing this part, but you're not so good at, you need to improve on this. Like that's obviously part of learning, but I think I've always maybe been like a bit of a perfectionist, and like that additional level of someone else telling you you've failed maybe just takes away the sense of learning, or there's maybe too much just like fear there, I guess, of the failure aspect that sort of constricts the autonomous motivation.
I hear you. And maybe it's thinking about how we think about failure as well, in terms of what we value in the learning process. Because I was recently seeing a lot of people, for example, loads of people since like throughout this lockdown have been learning to skate, and doing loads of like finding new hobbies and things like that. And I was seeing a lot of people just talking about this idea of the importance of putting yourself in positions of learning something new as an adult, in terms of how that familiarizes you with like failing or not being very good at something and having to kind of get better at and start again. I feel like the older that we get, that experience of failure becomes a lot more loaded than it maybe was once upon a time. It kind of becomes very definitive, very serious, kind of the end of something. Whereas failure, if we kind of redefine it, can actually be it's a process of learning. It's how things become iterative and kind of continue to evolve. But of course, within like a grading structure, if you didn't meet it, that is very definitive, because you don't continue on to the next part of your course. You don't pass that module, so you don't complete the sort of year. And I think it comes back to, I think it was Victoria that was speaking about it in the first session that we did, where it's like we're having these conversations, but then at the same time, these structures and systems do still exist. And that is a part of life. We have our autonomy and our intrinsic sort of motivations to do things, but in every aspect of life, not just in work or education, even within relationships, we always have to figure out how our intrinsic autonomy fits within a particular space, whether it's like what's happening, the narrative there, what needs to be fulfilled within that space. And so there's always that balancing. And so maybe it's questioning, okay, what are the things within my sort of motivation, my autonomy, that I can sort of compromise or adjust to fit within this body, and where are the areas that actually the structure needs to change because I shouldn't have to compromise X, Y, and Z. Maybe that's a question as well, in terms of how could the university do things differently so that it doesn't feel so restrictive, and what are the areas that I can sort of adjust and still have that vision that I have and still have my autonomy, but be able to work alongside what's happening around me, which is inevitable in the world, right? Cool. If anyone else wants to add something, please do. If not, I will continue to the next part. Cool.
Yeah, I would just say completely agree with that. I think potentially it's not putting so much weight. Oh, can you still hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Sorry, my computer's going nuts. It's potentially not putting so much weight on the final grading structure and having like that support network, so you get different chances of not assessment being reviewed. So if you have like a really core support network of your mates all doing similar, all in the same course, your cohort doing things together, and if you get, say you don't do so well in the grading criteria, but you know there's a few people and you really like their work and they're approving your work and they kind of give you that validation there, then potentially it wouldn't limit your learning so much to funnel it towards a certain marking criteria, and you'd feel supported in a different way.
Right.
If that makes sense.
And I think you raise an important point, because the thing is, a lot of what we keep coming like back to in these conversations is just this rippling effect, right? So the reason why we are afraid of the failure of not getting a particular grade is because when you graduate and you don't graduate with a good grade, that doesn't look good on your CV, on your applications. And so when you're going to then go get a job, it looks like, why did this person fail? It kind of then says that the 3 years, 4 years, 1 year, 2, however long you've been on that course for, it almost suggests that it didn't have value because this grade wasn't met. And then again, it goes back to when we're talking about the ways in which we all learn individually, and actually, is the learning in this kind of destination, or is it in the process, in this kind of other ways that we learn and the other things that are valuable that we pick up? And like you're saying, for example, when you have your network of friends who are interested in similar things, and it goes back to the thing, so, you know, maybe if the criteria that, for example, and I know there are a lot of companies as well, like agencies or sort of organizations that don't look at the sort of traditional things in terms of deciding whether they're going to hire a person or work with a person. And that then helps, because you can kind of be like, okay, over these 3 years, this is actually what I developed, whether it's like presenting it in a different way through a portfolio, or being able to show that actually all of these failures that I had, at the end of them, I actually came through and found I kind of had this breakthrough that I wouldn't have had if I didn't have this series of failures. And so maybe it's finding ways to be able to talk about failure in a way that highlights the learning that comes out of that, and the fact that all these kind of, when we talk about, you know, in creativity, innovation is really important. When we talk about, you know, innovation, original ideas, groundbreaking ideas, a lot of those come out of failure or through accidental kind of happenings, discoveries, and those discoveries can't happen without, you know, deviating. So I think, yeah, it goes back to how all of these things become a rippling effect.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's like reframing the failure of one and learning from that. Yeah, I think sometimes it can be quite inhibiting as well. Like, I was chatting to my dad as a fine art tutor, and I was just saying how I was looking at students and they were producing all this like really great art on a daily basis, continuously, and it's just whatever came to the forefront of their ideas. But I find, and I think it's quite an architectural student problem, that unless I've got a solid idea in my head, I won't start drawing or sketching, because of that inherent, it might not be perfect idea, what kind of stunts the learning. So if I think a reframing would have like a really positive effect on it.
Right. So maybe that's a great point. Maybe what needs to be, sorry, Kerry, I'll come back to you. So what I'm hearing from what you said is one of the things immediately that could change in the structure of the classroom, and you can tell me if this already exists or if it needs to be stretched further, is a space for producing work that doesn't have an end goal. So whether it's a period of time where it's like, actually, in this period, you're not doing it to meet a brief, you're not doing it to meet any sort of criteria, but actually create something, go out and look around your environments and just do for the sake of the process of doing it and not an end goal. Is that something that would be useful in terms of seeing what would come out of that, and then how that would then feed into when you do have an actual brief?
Yeah, I can definitely see the benefit. And I think it'd be a really nice way for other people to try the things that they're like apprehensive of going forward on.
Right.
But yeah, sounds grand.
I'm going to note that down, because I think that's one.
Yeah, I'm also trying to find my notebook.
That's a key thing. So almost like an experimental period. Sorry, Kerry, you were going to say something.
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say that I agreed with Flynn and what Flynn had been saying. I think, and what you were saying before, like, it's also, I think it's maybe part of the problem is seeing failure, like failing in opposition to passing. And like, so it's like, oh, these people passed and these people failed. And it's like that opposition that causes this like nervousness around failure. Not that like, not a more general, you didn't do this very well, or not, you need to improve in this area and this person needs to improve in a different area, but you're all obviously still learning.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. And I did put it in this presentation as well, because in the first session, we were talking about the Slow Grind book written by Georgina Johnson. And she created this manifesto around this cyclical way of thinking and working. And I think what comes up from what you're saying is just the binaries. And that actually life doesn't really work like that. We don't exist in binaries. Things are a lot more fluid. And so as you're saying, if we had this kind of more cyclical structure of we're all at different points, and it's not like a parallel race of because I'm behind you and you're over there, that means I'm not doing as well. But actually, it isn't that linear at all.
Yeah.
I will move forward. So the other part of the conversation, we were talking about self-actualization. And this is part of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And he put self-actualization as kind of like the final stage of like a human's development. So at the bottom of it is the basics that we need in order to survive, so like food, water, shelter, safety being the next one, security and stability, the next relationships, a sense of belonging and love, esteem, respect for yourself and others, and then finally self-actualization. And so before I read this kind of definition that also pulled out, I think, again, if we're looking at this in the wider picture in terms of what we need as human beings, and we've been speaking a lot about sort of class, we've been speaking about gender, we've been speaking about race in terms of just like structures of oppression that exist within our societies, within the systems that we operate in, within the institutions that we operate in, that make it so that if we're saying that this is an order of the needs that we have, you know, the basics aren't provided and accessible to everybody, let alone safety and then sort of relationships. And we're all at different parts of this, and maybe have some things partially fulfilled but not fully fulfilled. And this idea of sort of human rights. And again, it just goes back to this whole holistic way of thinking that we've been talking about, where what happens in the learning space is a reflection of what's happening in the world, and what's happening in the world is reflected in our learning spaces. And so when we're having these conversations, it's almost impossible to just focus on one specific space without thinking about how it interlinks to what's happening outside and around us. And then we almost find ourselves in this space of activism, I guess you can say, in terms of realizing that the world around us needs to change in order for our intrinsic motivations to be fulfilled, in order for the goals and the desires that we have to be met. So I'm going to read this self-actualization definition. So it's the final stage of development in Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This stage occurs when a person is able to take full advantage of their talents while still being mindful of their limitations. Self-actualization is the final stage in the linear growth of an individual. Maslow believed that in order to achieve this state of personal fulfillment, the person must first satisfy the preceding needs: psychological safety, love/belonging, esteem, in that order. According to the hierarchy of needs, self-actualization represents the highest order of motivations, which drives us to realize our true potential and achieve our ideal self. Self-actualization needs are also referred to as our being needs. These include personal and creative self-growth, which are achieved through the fulfillment of our full potential. So I personally have my own critiques of this idea, but before I kind of say that, again, I'm going to put it back to you and say, you know, what are your thoughts on that? I'll go back to the slide just so you can kind of have a look at it whilst we're discussing. But yeah, any thoughts on self-actualization?
As it's kind of realizing your full potentials in you specifically, like what, like the best version of yourself. My kind of thoughts in relation to the course are, if you were to kind of structure a course around this model, would it not be tutors and such more as facilitators of what your best thoughts and best aspirations for your practice to be? And I understand that that is part of the mantra of Central St. Martin's, but could it be a more pure version of that, in the sense that there are still restrictions at St. Martin's for what you're able to pursue, like the scale of intervention is fixed, yeah, it could be more kind of free in that sense.
It'd be helpful for me as well if you could elaborate on what that part of the mantra that CSM you're speaking about, and just when you're talking about the scale of intervention, if you can elaborate on that a bit.
So the kind of mantra is to develop your own practice to the best of your ability, but it does kind of remain in a somewhat fixed setting. The scale of architecture is still small scale interventions, as this is purported to be the best type of intervention is the urban environment to create the most good. But maybe not everyone agrees with that particularly. Maybe people want to explore other options. But I think overall as a university, the level of dogma is very low. But yeah, no, it's a question I don't have the answer to myself. But I mean, like last week where we were introduced during the lecture with community to make your own masters, which I thought was amazing. And ultimately that I feel, I don't know, it's kind of the feeling you would have going into a course like that, knowing that the intrinsic value is there, knowing that you are there to self-actualize for you and not to kind of appease a tutor or appease any kind of mark scheme. And I'm wondering how that, because I was so impressed with that, how that model could translate to St. Martin's. And yeah, it's quite a personal opinion, to be honest, but I just think kind of at post-grad level, you know what you want to do and you're kind of open to discovering new things, but it should ultimately be your choice in that sense. Yeah, I think because the make your own masters thing is so interesting and quite broad. If you applied that kind of idea to a specific subject course, it'd be interesting to see if it plays out and if it does kind of progress as this model is showing.
Right. That's that's really interesting actually. It's made me think as well. It's a very valid point. In terms of how much self-actualization can you do, and I think it goes back to what we were saying at the beginning. If we ourselves first, before we enter a learning space, before we enter a university or an institution, is the significance of having that clarity about where, because the critique that I had of this is this idea of the final stage in the linear growth of an individual, which firstly I don't believe growth to be linear, which is literally what just came up now when we were just speaking, and I don't know if I believe that there is this kind of final destination where you are officially self-actualized and you've officially kind of, so where is it, where there's a bit where I read that it basically suggests that you've kind of become the best of your ability, and kind of reach the highest heights of, where you can go. And I don't know if that exists, because one, that's constantly changing in terms of how I view myself, how I think about myself, and what I envision for my future is open to shifting and evolving. And sometimes there might be moments where that pauses and then starts again, or goes into a different direction. And so my concern with this idea is how that can become limiting, in terms of if we're kind of looking towards this destination of, if I do this, this, and this, and this, I will get to this final stage of being the ultimate, Optimus Prime version of myself. And as we were saying before, just the importance of having the room to experiment, to change, to grow. But I guess maybe in some ways the theory doesn't take away from that. Maybe it's just saying, these are the things that you need in order to even have that possibility of self-actualizing, but actually it's still a fluid thing. And again, I'm not saying this because I have the answers either. It's also something that I'm still thinking about. So I will put it back to anyone else if they want to add.
Yeah, I agree with that. And maybe it's more a problem with the diagram that makes it look very like final.
Mm-hmm.
Because I felt like the same, like actually sometimes I feel like I'm working at my full potential, but other ones of those points are not fully fulfilled or something. I don't know, but it doesn't feel like a simple, I'll do this and then I'll do this and then I'll do this and then I'm the best I can be.
Right. But I guess it's kind of a two-sided thing, because the point that I was trying to make is that if you have an understanding of, if we maybe thinking about it as something that's very much in the present, and so we can kind of look back in hindsight in terms of how far we've grown, and sort of look ahead in terms of where we hope to be presently. And if we can name those things when we're entering a learning space or entering an institution, then we can be very clear about what it is that we're there to receive. Because I think I can't see your name on the screen, but he was just speaking about the dogma at CSM.
Oh, it's Jake.
Hi, Jake. So yeah, Jake, what you were saying in terms of, having this idea of going to university in order to self-actualize and fulfill your potential. Perhaps you have these ideas about the kind of work that you want to create, or the kind of things that you want to learn, or the person that you want to be. And actually, when you kind of enter certain spaces, you don't really have that freedom to be your own master in that way, because you're almost doing things to appease whatever it is that you're trying to appease, because there's several different factors, right? And so maybe having that real clarity about what are sort of the core things that I need, and it just goes back to self-determination. What are my intrinsic motivations and like values? And I think being equipped with them, if you kind of think about it as a toolbox, means that if we kind of find ourselves in situations where that is being chipped away at, we can communicate that, and maybe that's a way of being able to combat and address that. Do you agree? Yes? No?
Yeah, no, that does make a lot of sense. I feel like listening to community was a good example, because I highly doubt that ergonomics and design solutions, in retaliation to kind of data bias and what they're working on, was any kind of module where they were in their studies. Like it would have been, and it sounds like something they formulated themselves, which has a lot of value and has obviously gone on to become their whole studio and source of income and everything. So can you facilitate the space where that kind of thing happens?
Right.
And
maybe it's kind of thinking, because again, I'll show it at the end, because I think it'd be really useful. Maybe the language around that sort of this mantra that you were talking about, this dogma that CSM has, could be revisited in terms of how much is what's being said here in terms of, this is a place for you to do X, Y, and Z. How much of that is actually being fulfilled? And do we need to sort of challenge and rewrite that? So it actually is reflecting the reality of the situation, reflecting what it is that you as yourselves are saying is missing, or is a need that hasn't been fulfilled. And so maybe part of this proposal is rewriting your own manifesto. That might be an interesting exercise to do in terms of rewriting your own dogma for learning that reflects the kind of space that you want to enter. And that is something maybe that would be more tangible as well.
Yeah, I think it'd be a really interesting exercise to try that.
Cool. Does anyone else want to add? I know there's a few others of you in the room. Forward. So I've expressed what my critique was. So yeah, I just wanted to, so I pulled out, I was revisiting the last 3 conversations that we've had. So the first one was kind of an introduction to bell hooks and the ethics of care, and this idea of the fact that we're living in a culture of domination, and how having a society that is devoid of sort of caregiving and ethics of love, the effects that has on us in terms of the way that we are able to relate, the way that we're able to learn, the freedom that we have in order to sort of be ourselves, to explore. And then the next session that we had was around power dynamics and social hierarchies. And that was kind of really interesting in terms of just like the kind of structure of the world, whether it's like capitalism, patriarchy, or the idea of how we value each other as people. And we had Ulungile, who would come to speak then, and India in the first one. And then last week we were talking about community, inclusivity, and there was one more keyword which has just slipped my mind, but community and inclusivity, I feel like kind of summarize that. So from these conversations that we're having, what you were all sharing, and some of the notes that had kind of come up, these are some of the keywords that I pulled out, which hopefully I would hope you be able to use them in terms of as to anchor some of your ideas. If you do decide to present your proposal as a manifesto, maybe these are some of the key words and key themes that will come up in that manifesto, or maybe you just want to pull out specific ones and use them because they are where you feel like your needs are really needing to kind of be met. Maybe you want to focus on that. So we've got language, accessibility, inclusivity, sustainability, co-design and co-learning, which came up in last week's session with Alex, where he was talking about his studio and this idea of sort of co-design when you're working within technology, working within groups. He was kind of working on a placemaking project. And this idea of, say if you have a client and they're kind of wanting to fill a specific brief, it's just not having this idea of being this kind of all-knowing voice or creator or designer, but actually these things need to sort of be co-designed with those desires and their intrinsic motivations as well as yours, and how the two sort of meet and complement each other. You're speaking about future crafting and technology, and asking the question of what are your core ethics and values, and how do you uphold them throughout your practice and the way that in which you interact with your peers, your colleagues, fellow students. We're talking about this idea of it being holistic, ecosystems, cyclical thinking, which came up again today, community, which also came up today, communication, so the tools that we use to communicate with each other, the spaces in which we communicate to each other, how accessible is the language that we use to communicate, and this idea of liberation, education, which is supposed to be a practice of liberation, creating is a practice of liberation, designing. And we're speaking about productivity, how productivity is measured, what makes us feel productive, how can this idea of productivity in order to fit into structures of capitalism, for example, actually be quite limiting. We're talking about motivation, which is one of the key things that came up today. Self-care and time. Time was something that you all spoke about a lot in terms of feeling like you don't have enough time, feeling like the time that you're expected to do certain things maybe isn't realistic, and just the pace that we're creating, which kind of came up in the whole thing of the slow grind as well, and just kind of restructuring the way that we think about time. So we do have that space to experiment as opposed to a rush to creating things in order to meet a specific brief or get to a final destination. We spoke about power and hierarchy, so having that power over yourself and your ideas, but also this exchange, this co-learning, and understanding that everyone is whose voices are of value, and then there isn't this kind of all-knowing authoritative figure within a learning space that's kind of deciding what is the truth. And we were talking about our potential, growth, and autonomy, which all came up today as well. So what I really wanted to do is just spend this time thinking about what your reimagined classrooms will look like. So I've made notes of some of the things that you came up with today. And on the next slide, I'm going to open it up just to start to jot some of these things down, and then I can send it out to everybody at the end. But yeah, before I move on, anyone else want to add or share anything or continue the discussion on some of the things that we've been talking about?
Yeah, what I would say, talking about self-actualization, I think often when I think of that as a concept, it kind of requires a vision in terms of what you want to achieve and what you want to get out of it, and how that roadmap and how to get there. And I think often I'm blocked in terms of that because I don't have a clear understanding of what I actually want to achieve. What's frustrating and kind of opposite of what Jake said. But yeah, I think that's my biggest barrier, is not knowing what framework I measure success on.
Right.
But I think other people also experience that. But yeah, I think it's having that clear path which like looks achievable and appealing rather than one or the other.
Right. So maybe the question that I would ask you then, because so when you decided to, and if I'm putting you on the spot and you don't want to answer, that's totally fine. But I'm interested, for example, when you chose to study the course, what was kind of what motivated you to do that? Why did you want to study architecture in this context?
I guess it was the drive of bringing like art and architecture together and to be honest, the last couple of years, it's the only thing that's occupied my headspace. So it's the only thing I really know about. And I was like, I kind of know that pathway there, and it kind of felt safe. And I knew I was like fairly interested in it, but it was that wider thing of involving the art world, what potentially, maybe because of COVID and stuff, I haven't fully utilized yet. So that's something I think and I kind of feel like it's shared across the board. Everyone kind of wants to get more engaged in the art side of CSM. But yeah, that's my main motivation.
Yeah.
But again, that's quite hard to reflect when you're doing a portfolio and you've got to have a set amount of criteria. You can't spend like 4 days making a massive painting for the sake of it.
Right. I hear you. But do I understand where you're coming from? And I guess I'm wondering whether you would consider that process of exploring and finding out exactly how you see the art world. So let's say by the end of your course, if you kind of get to that stage where you're like, okay, I now understand how my art practice and my architecture practice are going to come together, and these are the kind of things that I hope to then from now on continue to create. If that was something that you would see as an achievement.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's also expanding on those artistic skills and artistic knowledges. If I came to a point where I felt my practice could reflect those two things, yeah, I'll be over the moon.
Right. And it's interesting because I think a big part of that then it comes up to, which we were talking about again quite a lot throughout this sort of series, is this idea of storytelling and like, what's your story? And you know, what is it that you're wanting to communicate? And I think, you know, it's a really significant achievement to be able to kind of go through the process of unpacking and communicating and finding out what your story is. And if you can kind of figure out the tools to, and if it's a story that's still unfolding, and, you know, the final destination, if there is a final destination, it might be far away, but actually seeing sort of the value in the journey and being able to translate the journey and say that actually I started here with just kind of this thinking, but now 3 years later, this is where I've gotten to now, and this is my story. I think that's a really, and again, when we're talking about sort of intrinsic motivations, I think being able to tell and communicate our story is a very significant part of that. And then thinking about, how does my story fit into these criteria that have been set out? How can I find harmony within these extrinsic motivations or the controlled motivations, as Ed was talking about?
Yeah, definitely. I think maybe it'd be beneficial if I feel like sometimes we hand in the book and then we all take a massive break, then we come in, reflect on it for a day and then move off. But there's never a celebration of what you've come to at that point. Right. Whereas I think that would probably help quite a lot of people in this idea of what's it called? Imposter syndrome. If you were like you're saying, you've seen from the beginning to the end, if everyone could mark that point and be like, oh, I actually did quite a few good bits in this, I'll take this forward. And a celebration of it would probably be quite beneficial. Well, for me, I don't know about everyone else.
That's an interesting point. I'm going to note that down as well. But if anyone else wants to add on that, does anyone else feel like that would be something that would be useful? A moment to reflect.
You want to say something?
You go first,
I was just going to say I definitely get that feeling like it wasn't until maybe a year after finishing undergrad that I was like, whoa, I've actually learned a lot. Like when I first finished, I was like, have I learned anything? Like, and it's not till you like really reflect on it that you realize how much you've learned. So that maybe that moment to look back and say, yeah, actually I have done a lot of learning would be a good thing.
Yeah, and I agree as well. It would be nice to have something kind of positive at the end of a project, because the end of a project is always like a deadline, and it always feels really painful because there's a lot of pressure and kind of stress associated with it. But there's no kind of point to enjoy it or enjoy the work. And that point about kind of autonomous motivation, I always feel that's biggest at the start of the project, when you still have a lot of freedom and there's no pressure because you're far away from the deadlines, and that's when you kind of have the options to explore these things and you can get really excited about things. But that kind of fades away the further you get towards these deadlines and these marking criteria, and the more kind of you get reminded of them.
Right. Oh, thank you for sharing that. That's really yeah, that's a really poignant point. Like you're making it goes back to that thing of, being able to think about things cyclically. So if you're saying at the beginning is when you have the most of this sort of autonomous motivation, and then almost gradually it gets whittled down, and then you kind of submit the deadline, and then it just ends there. And so maybe it ends with this feeling of like relief that, okay, great, this is done, but you kind of don't get to go through that cyclical process of being able to reflect and enjoy the work that you're creating. And so, maybe what could that look like for you then, like an actual thing that you could say, hey, can we add this to the end of our deadlines or once we've submitted, so that we can kind of reflect on our work or enjoy our work, or maybe thinking about how it aligns with that initial motivation that we had.
I think maybe like I guess that's what the degree show is, but it's only at the very end finale. And I think maybe after like every big hand-in, it'd be really nice if everyone was given a break, like a week or two, and then you did like a mini exhibition just for your cohort. So you could put up your favorite piece or something, and then everyone would talk about it. Not formal or anything, just like stick it on the wall and just have a cup of tea, and like several you could kind of show off a bit and have a chat. I think that'd be quite nice.
That's in terms of the beginning when we talk about self-determination. So there were three things. There was the autonomy, there was competence, and there was relatedness. So it's like the autonomy is, being motivated and deciding what it is that you want to do. And then the competence is feeling like you're successful at it, that you're doing a good job, that you're meeting this criteria. And the relatedness was about how you connect with humans. And so what I'm hearing from what you're saying is just the significance of this. So remembering that the work that we create is social, it's meant to be experienced as well. And so maybe when you get so kind of bogged down in terms of, I need to meet this deadline, I need to make sure if it's marking material, I need to do my referencing, etc., that you lose the experiential part of your work, that actually, someone else is meant to feel this, like the feeling part, which goes back to us talking about love and this being about creating spaces of care. So I love that it can literally be just as simple as, let's like sit with a cup of tea, get some drinks, look at our work and be like, hey, that was really great. Or actually, look how far you've come. Remember when you first started on the course, you said that you wanted to create something like this. Look, you've actually created it now. I think that's really nice. It's really wholesome. Just noting that down. Cool. Is there anything else kind of want to add and speak about? I can share this manifesto with you now if you're still interested in seeing that as well. The slow grind one I was talking about.
Yeah, that sounds good. Sounds grand. Yeah, I think maybe to touch on what Nina said about, I do always find my site research work is where I'm doing different alternative forms of representation, because you can, and it's not aligning to it. But when it gets towards the end, I find myself falling into, I know this will work and I know it'll convey what I mean effectively. So you just fall into set patterns, where there's quite nice when you have that freedom just to go for it and just, freedom of failure, I guess.
Right.
Yeah.
So this was the manifesto of the slow ground. So Essentially, the majority of the time we can do better when we know better, and here's how. Rebel against the pace and bars currently set and respect each and everybody's creative and mental capacity, as well as their needs. That's how we safeguard our ecosystems and till the soil for socially and environmentally sustainable economies. Unlearn a few things and approach them with fresh eyes. Let's increase our consciousness when creating things we and others will love. Respect labor and the fruits of it, and wait a little while. There's no need to rush. Let's lean on each other a little more and ensure that those at the back are pushed all the way to the front. Stop all the stank attitudes and demigod complexes and stone throwing. Treat people like human beings by foregrounding their humanity. Nothing deserves to have a linear life. Think big, think cyclical, and give yourself more time to think. Be transparent, be conscious, be ethical, and be fair. Share your ideas, be countercultural. Let's restore what we've already broken and build an environment where we aren't afraid to fail, but are ever so thankful for the lesson. We deserve systems that recognize creativity's world-shaking power and people as our most precious and vital force. Community is key, so fall into one. That is the manifesto. Any thoughts? Cool. Oh, sorry. I think someone was about to say.
I was just going to say, I like the emphasis on choosing community is key, so fall into one. It's kind of like ensuring you have a support network for the benefit of you and that support network. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
But yeah.
I think freedom comes up a lot throughout all the things that you've been sharing throughout this series as well, in terms of what makes you feel free within your learning spaces. And I think time is one of the things that stops us from feeling free, right? Like, I'm running out of time. I'm limited within my time. And so, yeah, I think I'm really interested in the ways that we can maybe stretch time, you know, because I'm aware of the fact that there are things that are greater things. For example, like, you might not necessarily be able to change how long a course runs for, or how many, well, you could, but not quickly, how long a course runs for, or how long you have to work on a specific piece of work. But what are the ways that time can sort of be stretched or manipulated in order to allow us to feel more free? Especially because time is also a metric, right? It's essentially a way of measuring. And so in some ways, this sounds really like far-fetched and vague, because it is very much a very real thing. But also at the same time can be manipulated. So it also in some ways isn't a real thing. It can be stretched, it can be bent. So what are some of the ways that time can be challenged in order to remove some of those things that stop us from feeling free?
I think maybe part of it is, or like, this might only be a small part of it, but just like some sort of like recognition that when you are coming to the end of the year or the 2 years or the unit or something, that the work that you're handing in or your portfolio is not, it's never going to be a finished piece of work. Like, it's not, like, in terms of time, it's not at the end. It's just like, it's where you've got to, but there is, if it's ever going to be a fully actualized project, it's only, you know, done part of its journey. Because I think a lot of pressure comes because you feel like you're having to hand in a finished project, and people just feel like what they've done is inadequate and not finished.
Right.
But, yeah.
So a question in that sense, when you are submitting your work, so I'm obviously the architecture course is still new to me, so I've been kind of learning in terms of how you submit things. So I know, for example, let's say you've designed or conceptualized a project, there's always a written piece that goes alongside that to communicate what it's about. Am I correct in saying that?
Not always. So like when we previously submitted for unit 1, it was you have the main portfolio and then a design diary, which does that sort of tells the journey of it, but it doesn't have to be all writing. It can also be like images and stuff, but that sort of supports the main portfolio, I guess.
Right. And so with that sort of design diary, or just the other tools that you might use to communicate the journey, is it kind of regular practice to talk about it as something that highlights the significance of it being a work in progress and kind of the value of that? So maybe talking about, okay, throughout this unit, this is where I got to, but if this was to be an ongoing project, this is where I visualized, where else it could go. These are the other possibilities of this project. So my project, because like you're saying, you have a deadline, it ends, and then that's it. But maybe being able to envision the life of your work beyond this hand-in, and being able to kind of have a moment to just kind of imagine how it would be experienced, what else it could do, what other practices or technologies it could intersect with, and just kind of have that as a really significant part of your communicating again your story. Is that regular practice?
I think there is room to speculate, and you're encouraged to speculate on how like it could go forward, but I think it's more that it still feels like a very final document, like it's like this is the end of the project, and like that's how it's, I don't know, I'm maybe that's just a personal feeling. I'm not sure if other people get the same sense, but yeah.
I think I definitely feel like at the end of the project, when you're handing in, you're scared sometimes to put things forward that are kind of work in progress ideas that you've kind of had at the back of your head. Like if you had time, maybe you'd develop that, but it kind of feels scary to put that in as like the final thing, because you feel like it's not perfect. And if this is something you're being marked on, you want everything that you put in to be kind of resolved.
Right. Okay, so maybe it could be something to propose would be really specifically adding something within these metrics that are used to assess, that sets out specific room for you to submit these work in progress things and tell what the story and the life of your work is beyond what you've been able to submit. So just think about how it becomes less definitive and final, and you're able to enjoy it and kind of see it as this ever evolving iterative journey that you are going through whilst you're on the course. And so that could be something that you propose. How can we start to rethink what we value as our work? Why is it that only this kind of very finite finished product is what's valuable, but how do we place value on the thinking that I've been doing to get here, and the thinking that I didn't get to finish within this time constraint? Would that be useful?
Yeah, I think that could be useful. I think maybe the balance is but making that not feel like just another requirement,
Right.
more like, if you know what I mean, like.
Right, so that freedom then becomes rigid because it's now something that you have to.
Yeah, possibly, but I think maybe that's just in how it's delivered, not necessarily, not like, I think that is like what I was sort of aiming at, I guess, with my first comment, but yeah.
I think in some ways the design diary was meant to be that, and they did kind of say, this, you can put work in progress things in there, but I guess because of time constraints, that just felt like another massive thing to do, to kind of fill up with content. And when you were still trying to finish like the final drawings for your final design in the actual portfolio, so it did feel like another stress rather than being kind of an opportunity.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think quite a lot of things have come out from this session today. And I hope that you feel like there are some tangible things that you can kind of propose that will make the immediate sort of experience of being within your classroom and your learning space better and improve it. Because I think there's a range of kind of goals. There's the immediate things that can change, and then there's a sort of wider issues that are even beyond just your course, like we were saying, are also societal issues that we can work towards, but there aren't things that are going to happen overnight. But I do hope that there's some things that you can kind of take away from this immediately and be like, hey, we need this. So that was the sort of end of what I had to present on. Okay, sorry, I cut you off.
Oh, nothing. I was just saying in agreement. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So that was the end of what I'd kind of put together in terms of a presentation. But we still do have another 40 minutes. So you can feel free to, if there's a way that you would like to use that time, let me know. We can kind of go into another discussion. But equally, I'm also happy to wrap up. So we can kind of decide that. Everyone's gone silent now.
I'm trying to think about next discussion points and what would be beneficial. I think maybe I need 2 minutes to get in that space.
Oh, that's a bit close. I was going to add. I think
dramatic entrance.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting to be so close to the camera. The discussion around like self-actualization, I thought was like it's such an interesting like concept, because I think it's like it is sort of, even if you take it out of the specifics of like architecture in the course, it's at the heart of like what we're all doing, like a creative course. We're kind of creative people. We're all aiming for that. You know what I mean? Like we're all kind of like trying to find our own way to working out like whether we necessarily are able to vocalize it or not. We're all trying to get that, like chase that kind of feeling of like, yeah, I'm doing something that is like fulfilling my potential. You know what I mean? And I think it's interesting to have it acknowledged and like talk about it as a concept. And I think it'd just be interesting, like if earlier on in our sort of like educational careers, we will talk about it as an idea and what it means and how to kind of like formalize it, because everyone is behind everything, but you don't really know what it is. But then someone explains it and you go, yeah, no, that's literally that's what I'm aiming for, I think it's just, it would just be interesting, like even maybe it's just a broader point about education in general, but like if in school, you know what I mean, if you were teaching kids about wanting to like, I don't know, what career do you want to do? It's like, how do you want to like how do you see yourself like being self-actualized as a person? How do you see yourself like fulfilling your potential? I feel like that would be a much more interesting like thing to think about, even when you're like 11, 12 years old, and like, oh, I want to be this, or I want to make this much money or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's no question really, just sort of that's a really interesting, it was an interesting point to raise about the hierarchy of needs. So thank you for that.
Thank you. That's a really valid point, and it's why it's a lot of what I was feeling and thinking about myself when I wanted to create this series, because I was like, these are the things that I think about, but I don't feel like there's a space for them. And literally, like you said, why don't we ask those questions in terms of our needs, our base needs as human beings? How do you feel? Before, all the other things in terms of what can you produce, how are you going to be of value or useful to society, but actually what makes you feel free, what makes you feel happy, what makes you feel connected. And if you can being able to name our emotions, and for me, one of the things again with this series is how do we become more emotionally intelligent and prioritize our emotional intelligence before we kind of, I think there's a lot of emphasis on education in terms of what you've read, what school you went to, what kind of discipline or institution you've been a part of, and sometimes that neglects the human element of us in terms of what we feel. And that, like you're saying, is literally behind at the core of everything that we do, why we do it, how we connect, why sometimes we don't feel fulfilled, or we feel we're kind of lost or trying to kind of find our way through something, is because we don't have that opportunity. And I think things like, I know for example in primary school we have like I had like PSHE. I think that was supposed to be that, but it never really was. It never really gave us those tools to communicate, you know, what makes me feel like myself, or who am I? What are the things that make me feel like I'm contributing something to the world, that make me feel like I'm enjoying the life that I live? And I think from there on, it's a lot easier to then build in terms of what type of work am I going to do? And if the work is linking to who you are, but a lot of the time it's the other way around. You are what you do. Like whatever work you do, that defines who you are. And that defines how, you know, how you're valued in society. And that's also a class issue as well. And it's a lot of what Bell Hooks talks and writes about in terms of our societies are fundamentally lacking these ethics of care. And we all at the same time really want it, like we need it. We're constantly talking about it and tapping at it. We never get to kind of permeate and get a bit further. And so, yeah, I think it's interesting to then think about, okay, what needs to change then so that we can start having those conversations at the very beginning? Like, how is that going to be implemented when the course description is being written? Do you write into that a manifesto of how are these students that enter this course, that enter this university, going to feel like who they are is enriched? How are they going to feel liberated within these spaces? So yeah, I think you raised something really important, and I'm glad that, yeah, that you felt that way as well from having this conversation.
Yeah, I think potentially in school, well, definitely in school, there was still like a stigma attached about trying to talk about like an emotional maturity and an emotional intelligence. If you were talking about like what's the best path to feel the greatest connectivity to everyone, there is still a stigma attached to it. It's only now at a mature years is it become acceptable, or maybe it's because it's now more acceptable in these times we live in, where these things are people are far more aware of these things. But to see them solidified, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying about like self-actualization. You kind of need the vision and what you want to self-actualize to get there. But maybe if your vision is dictated by what you want to get emotionally out of it, then that's a good way to frame that.
Yeah, actually that answers the question that you asked earlier in terms of,
yeah.
like, if it's this thing that you're supposed to do, then maybe it's hard because you might not know that straight away, but you can always name what you want to feel. And then maybe that can be the thing that guides you towards.
I feel like with the thing with having that like vision and having that kind of like set, you're kind of that idea of like you're striving to know what you want to do. You know, for me, I kind of think of it as like the self-actualization part kind of is in that process, as opposed to being like, because I don't really feel I'll ever necessarily be like, okay, I'm gonna have this like set in stone concrete kind of idea of like, I want to get here. Like I have ideas, but like I think for me it's like about working out that it's about asking those questions and like having a like kind of developing the language around asking the question, and like how you ask it of yourself, and like how you kind of constantly evolve that sense of like where the end goal is, as opposed to kind of, I don't know, trying to always like get it and then make it, because you always, the temptation is to like get it, and it's when you get an idea of it and you're like, okay, I need to fix this, and like the solider this thing is, the more I'll know how to get there kind of thing. But then I think as soon as you try and make it solid, it almost just, the more solid you make it, the less you can kind of get to it.
Yeah, I love that you say that, because that's something that that's why I had that critique of the self-actualization, because I was like, that in itself, if we're saying that it's a final destination, you know, can kind of be limiting. And I agree with you in the sense that, I know for me, in my own experience, the self-actualization is in the everyday. It's a constant process. It's something that is very much like living and breathing with me. Like I'm kind of moving along with it. And if I share sort of my own experience, and that's for one, I'm somebody that has struggled a lot going through, whether it's like education, but even in terms of like my career, because I've never seen myself, when I think about my kind of vision for the future, or even when people talk about creating this kind of 5-year plan, there's always been a series of things for me. There's never been this one ultimate thing. So even in terms of my career, I wouldn't say, if I'm completely utterly honest, I have one dream job role that I see myself in. And I've always, there's that whole conversation of kind of the jack of all trades, but the master of none. I'm definitely what people describe as a jack of all trades. Like, I do a number of things. And there's this idea that if you're doing a number of things, that means that, you can't do them well. But actually, life is long and you can do them well. But you don't have to be doing everything all at the same time either. So if there are like 5 things that I'm interested in wanting to master, I might be spending 3 years on one, take a pause on that, focus on another one for a couple of years, and the things that I learned from that one link into the other one that I go into. But there's the idea that you either have to be doing everything at once really, really well, or you need to be focusing on one. Otherwise, you're confused, you're lost, you don't know who you are, you haven't actualized yourself. And that was something where for myself, I had to completely reframe that, because it meant that whenever I was entering certain spaces, this theme of failure and this imposter syndrome, I think, Kerry, you were talking about imposter syndrome, kept coming up. Because like, I'm not fitting into the structure of things, I'm doing too many things, I need to narrow it, it's not making sense. And so I realized actually the value for me in what I'm doing, even in coming into this course, for example, like, I'm not coming from an architecture background. And so that could be a limiting factor in terms of what do I have to share? I don't know anything about architecture, but actually the other practices that I have, like, link in with that. And so, yeah, that's something that I'm having to constantly kind of reframe for myself. And when I think about what my self-actualization looks like, actually, it's being able to operate in a space where this kind of range of skills, this kind of dynamic set of interests can coexist and inform one another. And I'm aware of the fact that that's going to be an ongoing journey for me. And that's something that's going to be constantly changing. And I'm comfortable with that. But I had to get to that stage of being okay with that, so that when I am navigating things in the world, I don't constantly feel that kind of pushback to say, hey, what are you doing? You need to figure this out. But actually, no, I know where I'm going and know what it is that I'm doing and how I'm going to be able to do that. And that was the kind of manipulation of time for me, in terms of realizing that, yes, life is short, but it is also very long. And I've got time and I can focus on something for a long time and move on to something else, and that's okay. So that's been my own experience. I don't know if that's, useful, but I thought it might be worth sharing.
I think that's really nice to hear, especially at this moment where we're starting the next project and we're being asked to kind of pick which theme we want to go into. And then over the year, we're going to narrow it down sort of to be more and more specific, and then kind of going to end up being an expert on this one really specific thing. And it's nice to feel like you can still kind of keep that breadth and keep reading things that might not be to do with the one topic that you want to do, but remember that they all kind of inform each other.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
Yeah, it's almost like remembering that, I can't remember who said it, maybe Ken Robinson, but like most people are training for jobs that don't exist yet. And so in that case, like, you can't even really think about like what you're trying to achieve if it doesn't even exist yet. And lots of people are always retraining, or like you said, I just think I agree. I think it's nice to hear from your personal experience that is true, that there is time to do more than one thing.
And I think that's why the imagining is so important in the future casting, because there has definitely been a lot of, like, I've been able to nail certain things. And when I look back in hindsight, I'm like, okay, I always had these ideas and I always had this thought, but there was no space that I saw it fitting in. But I just kind of kept doing it anyway. And like you're saying, if we're thinking about in terms of like culture and society, we are who shape culture and society. And so we can change that. Let's say, even if we think about the idea of the fact that you can be a social media influencer, that's a job that you can do. There was a time that didn't exist. So these things that feel very rigid, actually, that's why I was saying before, a lot of things can be changed and manipulated, but they can feel very rigid in real time. But actually, if it's being able to think about, I'll try and find it because I saw it the other day. It was this Japanese social structure that was about the work that we do and how that links to who we are. It was really, really interesting. I've forgotten the name of the theory, but I'll find it and send it round. But it was just this idea of, if I can think about, these are my things that I need in order to feel self-actualized, what kind of role could that be? And okay, how am I going to go about making that exist? Because it could, even though it doesn't right now. And that's I think it requires a lot of imagination and a lot of dreaming, because it's not within your kind of tangible reality. And that's what I really enjoy about the process of kind of future casting and imagining, and that playfulness that I think the older that we get, we start to lose. Because when you're young, that's a normal practice, like imagining your future world. And actually another thing that came up as well throughout this lockdown period, obviously so many of us have been at home and the outside world isn't something that we've been able to experience. And then I found a lot of people were playing these kind of POV games like Sims and Animal Crossing and all these things that kind of allow you to create a world essentially, and there's kind of the freedom that you get within that, where the constraints of the real world don't exist here. You can literally do whatever. And I think when we were younger, that was again a lot more normal, and you kind of had these ideas of life is going to be like this, and I'm going to do this, and it's going to look like this. And the older that we get, obviously because of logic and reason and practical things, that gets dwindled away. So how do we make time to allow ourselves to kind of dream and think about these things and know that actually they could be real, and it's not a waste of time, it's not playfulness, and it's not childish, but it's actually significant to the fulfilling of our needs as human beings, being able to feel like we're free to create new worlds.
Yeah, I think that kind of reflects in modern day working culture as well. I find sometimes there's a reflection that if you're having a laugh at work and you're enjoying what you're doing, then you're not taking work seriously. And really it's just like, how has that happened in a way that happiness should be restricted when you're doing a thing 9 to 5, probably more. It's just kind of blows my mind. But yeah, that idea of playfulness ties into that.
Yeah, and that's capitalism, isn't it? That's the work of capitalism. It's, you need to be productive and efficient in order to hit targets and make the most amount of money as possible. So if you're spending 20 minutes laughing, that's 10% less of the money that we could have made, and we can't have that, you know?
Yeah, you can't commodify that yet.
Nah. Okay, cool. So again, as I keep saying, let me know what you want to do. We can wrap up. What I will do actually today, within the next hour after this session, I was meant to do it throughout, but that's my own fault. I didn't get around to doing that. But one, I said I'm going to put together a list of the resources, the books that we've spoken about, some of the theories and the links, and I'll send it around just so you have them on paper if you want to reference or use any of those things. So the referencing list, I'll do that by Friday. And then the other thing I was going to send around is just kind of like a couple questions for you to share, like feedback on the sessions and how useful they were. And again, part of my practice is creating this space where it's like I'm open to being critiqued. So if there were things about the way that it was run that you feel like could have been maybe like better or improved in particular ways, please do let me know, and I'll always take that on board as well. So yeah, I'll do that this week and send it around to everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much. It was a really enjoyable lecture series, and it was quite nice, the different guests and stuff you had on. It felt far more, it was still learning quite a lot, but it was a lot more relaxed than a normal lecture series. Sometimes they can be a bit rigid and formal, and it was quite nice. It being very informative, but also just, I don't know, a more conversation, which was nice.
I'm glad. Thanks. That was one of my goals.
Yeah, it was. I've really enjoyed it. I found it really useful and really like inspiring, I guess. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad. Okay, cool. I will wrap up. Thank you all for like joining. I appreciate your time as well, and just like your contributions and wanting to be a part of the conversation, and the fact that these are things that interest you as well is really motivating for me, in terms of, like I was saying, like this series is part of my own self-actualization. It's part of my own motivations in terms of being able to create these spaces where we can talk about these things. So I appreciate that as well from your end. So I'm going to end the Zoom now. Have a great evening, and I'll catch up with you via email, or I'll see you during like your course and your reviews as well. You know, that's going to be happening over the next couple of weeks as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Bye.